My name is Herman Wallace, 68 years old, and 6 months ago I lost my only son Richard to cancer. He left behind a tech company worth millions, 2 beautiful grandchildren, and a daughter-in-law named Amanda, who took over everything. The last words she said to me were, "Don't expect a penny of your son's company shares." Little did she know what would happen at the reading of the will. Before I tell you what happened at that lawyer's office, drop a comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to hear more stories like mine. I never imagined I'd be fighting for what my son wanted me to have. Richard and I had always been close, especially after his mother Elaine passed away from a sudden heart attack when he was just 10 years old. One moment we were a complete family living in our modest home in Burlington, Vermont. The next I was a single father working construction jobs trying to keep our lives from falling apart. Those early years were tough. I would wake up at 4:30 in the morning, make Richard's lunch, drive him to his friend's house where he'd stay until school started, then head to whatever construction site I was assigned to that week. Some nights I wouldn't get home until after 7, bone-tired and covered in dust, but I always made time to check Richard's homework and hear about his day. Money was tight, real tight. I remember one winter when the heating bill was so high I had to choose between paying it or buying new winter boots for Richard. I chose the boots, and spent that January sleeping in 3 layers of clothes with extra blankets. Never told Richard about that. Didn't want him worrying about adult problems. Despite our struggles, Richard was a happy, curious kid. By 13, he was taking apart old computers people had thrown out, figuring out what was wrong, and putting them back together. He'd sit at our kitchen table surrounded by circuit boards and wires, his eyes lighting up when he got something working again. "Dad, look," he'd say, showing me some old desktop humming back to life. I didn't understand half of what he was doing, but I knew my boy had a special kind of intelligence. In high school, Richard started building websites for local businesses. The pizza place down the street, the hardware store where I bought my supplies, the local flower shop. $25 here, $50 there. He saved every penny in an old coffee can labeled college fund. I was setting aside what I could too, but construction work is seasonal, and winters in Vermont meant lean months. When Richard got accepted to Boston University for computer science, I knew we were in trouble. His scholarships covered about half the cost, but the rest would have bankrupted us. That night I sat him down at our kitchen table. "Son, I'm so proud of you getting into BU," I said, "but I don't think we can swing it financially." Richard's face fell for just a moment before he said, "It's okay, Dad. I can go to community college for 2 years, then transfer." That's when I made a decision that would change both our lives. I sold our family home, the only one Richard had ever known, and moved us into a small apartment. Between that and working double shifts whenever I could get them, we scraped together enough for his tuition. The day I drove him to Boston, Richard turned to me and said, "I'm going to pay you back for everything someday, Dad. I promise." I told him the only payback I wanted was for him to make the most of his opportunities, and boy, did he ever. Richard thrived in college, always calling me with excitement about some new programming language or technology concept he was learning. I didn't understand most of it, but I loved hearing the passion in his voice. During summer breaks, he interned at tech companies, building connections and experience. After graduation, Richard had job offers from several big tech firms, but he turned them all down. He came home one weekend with a thick business plan under his arm. "Dad, I've got an idea for a software company," he said, spreading papers across our small dining table. "It's a security system that can protect small businesses from cyber attacks without needing an IT team. Most security software is either too expensive or too complicated for small businesses, but mine will be affordable and simple." Richard's eyes shone with that same excitement I'd seen when he fixed his first computer. He explained his business plan in detail, careful to break it down in ways I could understand. He'd need startup money, though, more than he had saved from his internships. Without hesitation, I went to the bank and withdrew $45,000, my entire life savings, including what I'd set aside for retirement. When I handed Richard the check, his hands shook. "Dad, this is everything you have," he said. "No," I replied. You're everything I have, and I believe in you. We converted my basement into Richard's first office, with second-hand desks and computers he'd rebuilt. He brought in a college friend, Garrett, as his first employee. I'd bring them sandwiches and coffee during their late-night coding sessions, watching with pride as they built something from nothing. For the first year, Richard barely paid himself, putting everything back into the business. I picked up extra construction jobs to help cover our living expenses. There were moments when both of us wondered if we'd made a mistake, especially when a major software update failed and they lost a week's work, or when a potential investor backed out at the last minute. But Richard persevered. 2 years in, Tech Fusion landed its first major client, a chain of 20 regional grocery stores. 6 months later, they signed a contract with a healthcare provider. By year 3, the company had 15 employees and was valued at $5 million. Richard insisted on paying me back my investment with interest, though I tried to refuse. "You believed in me when nobody else would, Dad," he said as we sat in his new office downtown. "You've always been there, supporting every dream I've had. I wouldn't be here without you." Those were the good days, before Amanda came into the picture, before the cancer, before everything changed. Richard and I would go fishing on Sundays, just like we did when he was a boy. We'd sit in our little boat on Lake Champlain, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes saying nothing at all, just enjoying each other's company while waiting for the fish to bite. On one of those fishing trips, Richard turned to me and said, "You know what, Dad? I think we made it." I remember smiling and thinking life couldn't get any better. If only I'd known how quickly things would change. Richard met Amanda Palmer at a tech conference in San Francisco. He had been invited to speak about cybersecurity for small businesses, and she was handling marketing for the event. Richard called me the night they met, more excited than I'd heard him in years. "Dad, I met someone," he said. "She's brilliant and beautiful and understands my work." Amanda was certainly impressive on paper. MBA from Wharton, experience with several high-profile tech companies, articulate and polished. When Richard brought her to Vermont to meet me 3 weeks later, I tried to be welcoming despite feeling things were moving awfully fast. She arrived wearing designer clothes that seemed out of place in our little town. When Richard proudly showed her around his first office in my basement, she smiled politely, but I caught her wrinkling her nose slightly at the low ceiling and humble setup. "Your son is quite the entrepreneur, Mr. Wallace," she said to me later. "Tech Fusion has enormous potential. With the right marketing strategy, it could be worth 10 times its current value." Something about the way she said it made me uncomfortable, as if my son's company was just a number to her, a potential asset rather than Richard's passion project, built from years of hard work. But Richard was so obviously smitten that I kept my concerns to myself. What father wants to ruin his son's happiness? Their relationship progressed at warp speed. Within 4 months, Richard proposed. Within 6, they were planning a wedding that seemed increasingly elaborate with each passing week. When I saw the final budget, I nearly had a heart attack. 300 guests, a venue in the Berkshires that cost more than my annual salary. Flowers flown in from somewhere in South America. "Son, this seems excessive." I ventured one evening when Amanda was at a meeting. "Dad, we can afford it," Richard assured me. "The company's doing great. Besides, Amanda says this wedding is as much about business networking as celebration. Half the guest list is potential investors or clients." The wedding went off without a hitch, though I felt somewhat out of place among the wealthy tech executives and venture capitalists who seemed to make up most of Amanda's side. I gave a speech about watching Richard grow from a curious boy taking apart computers to the man he'd become. I noticed Amanda checking her watch halfway through. After the honeymoon, changes came quickly. Richard and Amanda bought a house in an exclusive neighborhood outside Boston, a sprawling 5-bedroom colonial with a 3-car garage and swimming pool. When I visited for the first time, Amanda gave me a tour that felt more like a showcase of their wealth than a welcome to their home. "This is Italian marble," she explained in the master bathroom, "and these fixtures are all custom-made." The designer who did this house also did homes for 3 different tech billionaires. Tech Fusion continued to grow, with Amanda now handling all marketing and public relations. She certainly had a knack for it, securing features in technology magazines and speaking slots for Richard at prestigious conferences. The company expanded to 50 employees, then 100. They opened a second office in Austin. When Amanda announced she was pregnant with twins, Richard was overjoyed. He called me immediately, his voice cracking with emotion. "Dad, I'm going to be a father," he said. "Can you believe it?" I felt a surge of happiness for my son, and yes, a bit of pride knowing I would be a grandfather. I decided to sell my Vermont apartment and move closer to them in Massachusetts. Richard was thrilled with the idea, but Amanda seemed less enthusiastic. "Don't you have friends in Vermont?" she asked when Richard mentioned my planned move. "Won't you miss your community there?" Despite her thinly veiled objections, I found a small apartment about 20 minutes from their home. I wanted to be close enough to help with the grandchildren, but not so close that Amanda would feel I was intruding. Jackson and Emma were born on a snowy February morning. Holding those tiny babies in the hospital, I felt the same overwhelming love I'd experienced when Richard was born. I promised myself I would be the best grandfather possible, just as I'd tried to be the best father. For the first few weeks, I was a regular presence at their house, bringing home cooked meals, helping with night feedings, giving Richard and Amanda a chance to rest. But gradually, I noticed Amanda creating distance. "We have a nanny now, so you don't need to come over so often," she told me one afternoon. "The babies are on a very specific schedule," she explained. "Another time when I asked to take them for a walk. It's better not to disrupt it." Richard was working longer hours than ever, expanding the company into international markets. When I did see him, he looked tired but excited about Tech Fusion's growth. The company had secured a round of funding that valued it at $50 million. My $45,000 investment seemed like ancient history. The first major holiday after the twins were born, I expected to be included in their Thanksgiving plans. When I called Richard to ask what time I should arrive, he sounded uncomfortable. "Actually, Dad, we're going to Amanda's parents' place in Connecticut this year," he said. "It's easier with the babies not to travel too far." "I could meet you there," I suggested. "I don't mind the drive." There was a pause. Then Richard said, "Amanda's parents are doing a small gathering this year. Just immediate family." The words stung like a slap. Wasn't I immediate family? Hadn't I been Richard's only parent for most of his life? I spent that Thanksgiving alone in my apartment with a frozen turkey dinner, trying not to feel sorry for myself. That was the beginning of a pattern. Christmas brought another exclusion, with a last-minute invitation only after I called Richard directly. Even then, I arrived to find Amanda's parents, siblings, and extended family had been there for days already. I felt like an afterthought in my son's life, a status that would only worsen as time went on. The next 3 years brought a growing distance between Richard and me. What had once been weekly fishing trips became monthly phone calls, then occasional text messages. Each time I tried to arrange a visit with my grandchildren, there seemed to be an obstacle. Dance lessons, swimming classes, play dates, trips to Amanda's parents. I went from seeing the twins weekly to barely once a month. I tried speaking with Richard about it, catching him alone one Sunday when I managed to convince him to meet for breakfast. "Son, I feel like I'm being pushed out of your lives," I said carefully, not wanting to sound accusatory. "Is everything okay?" Richard looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. "Everything's fine, Dad. We're just busy. The company's growing so fast, and the kids have so many activities." "I could help with the kids," I offered. "Pick them up from school sometimes or watch them on weekends when you need a break." Richard glanced at his phone as a text came in. "That's Amanda. I need to go, Dad. Meeting with potential investors today. I'll talk to her about having you over more often." Okay, but nothing changed. If anything, the distance grew. I sent birthday gifts for the twins that went unacknowledged. I left voicemails for Richard that weren't returned for days. Meanwhile, Tech Fusion was becoming a major player in the cybersecurity industry. I read about my son in business magazines and saw him interviewed on CNBC, looking confident in tailored suits that cost more than I used to make in a month. I told myself to be happy for him. This was what success looked like, wasn't it? My boy had made it big, created security for his family that I never could. If that meant I saw less of him, well, that was the price of achievement. Then came the day that changed everything. I was grocery shopping when I ran into Diane, Richard's executive assistant since the early days of Tech Fusion. She looked surprised to see me. "Mr. Wallace," she said, "how are you holding up with everything going on?" I had no idea what she meant. "Everything's fine," I replied, confused. "Just picking up some essentials." Diane's face fell. "You don't know, do you? About Richard?" My heart nearly stopped. "No, what about Richard?" She explained in hushed tones that my son had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 weeks earlier. Stage 4. The doctors had given him months, not years. I abandoned my shopping cart right there in the aisle and drove straight to Richard and Amanda's house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Why hadn't he told me? Why had I heard this from his assistant and not my own son? When I arrived, a security guard at the gate initially refused to let me in. "Mrs. Wallace isn't expecting visitors today," he said. "I'm not here to see Mrs. Wallace," I nearly shouted. "I'm here to see my son, who apparently has cancer that nobody bothered to tell me about." After several tense minutes and a phone call to the house, the guard reluctantly opened the gate. Amanda met me at the front door, her expression cold. "Herman, this isn't a good time," she said, blocking the entrance. "Richard is resting. He's on a very specific treatment schedule." "He's my son," I said, my voice breaking. "My only child. How could you not tell me he was sick?" "Richard didn't want to worry you," she replied smoothly. "He's handling this his way, with the best doctors. Your showing up unannounced like this disturbs his peace." "Let me see him," I insisted. "Just for a few minutes." Amanda looked like she wanted to refuse, but something in my expression must have warned her not to push me further. She led me upstairs to their bedroom suite, where Richard lay propped against pillows, watching financial news on a large television. The sight of him shocked me. In just 3 weeks, he had lost weight, his face gaunt and skin yellowed. An IV stand stood beside the bed. "Dad?" he said, looking surprised and a little embarrassed. "What are you doing here?" "I ran into Diane," I explained, moving to his bedside and taking his hand. "Richard, why didn't you call me?" Before he could answer, Amanda interjected. "Richard wanted to wait until we had a treatment plan in place. No need causing unnecessary worry." Richard looked too weak to argue. I sat with him while Amanda hovered nearby, clearly unhappy with my presence. Richard tried to reassure me that he was getting the best care, that there were promising experimental treatments, but I could see in his eyes what he wasn't saying. As I was leaving, Richard gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." I wasn't sure if he meant for not telling me about his illness or for something deeper, something about the years of growing distance between us. The next weeks were a nightmare of trying to be there for my son while navigating Amanda's constant obstacles. She established visiting hours that often changed without notice. She hired private nurses who treated me like an intruder. When I brought photo albums of Richard's childhood to cheer him up, Amanda put them away, saying they were collecting dust and bad for his allergies. Richard declined rapidly, despite the expensive treatments. The cancer was aggressive, spreading to his liver and lungs. I would sit beside his bed when permitted, sometimes just watching him sleep, remembering the little boy who used to climb into my lap with picture books. One afternoon, I arrived to find Amanda and several men in suits in Richard's bedroom. They had papers spread across his bed, and Richard was signing documents with a shaking hand. "What's going on here?" I asked, alarmed at seeing my clearly exhausted son being made to handle business at such a time. "Board meeting," Amanda said curtly. "Richard needs to arrange for temporary leadership while he's in treatment." "Can't this wait?" I pleaded. "Look at him. He's exhausted." Richard looked up at me, his eyes sunken. "It's okay, Dad. These decisions can't wait. The company has to keep running." I stood helplessly as they continued their meeting, watching my son struggle to focus on the documents before him. When the business associates finally left, Richard fell into an exhausted sleep. I sat by his side while Amanda made calls in the next room. Her voice animated as she discussed stock options and board appointments, as if my son weren't dying just feet away. That night, driving back to my apartment, I realized with horrible clarity that Amanda was already preparing for a future without Richard. She was securing her position, ensuring control, and I was being systematically pushed further and further away from my son during what would be his final days. The last 2 weeks of Richard's life were a battleground, not against the cancer, which had clearly won its vicious war against my son's body, but between Amanda and me for access to him. She established a visitor's schedule that gave me just 1 hour each day, always in the afternoon when Richard was most likely to be sedated after his pain medications. Through sheer persistence and the sympathy of one of the night nurses, I managed a few precious moments alone with my son. During one of these, Richard opened his eyes with surprising clarity. "Dad," he whispered, his voice so weak I had to lean close to hear him. "Take care of Emma and Jackson. Promise me." "I promise," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But you're going to get through this." He gave a small shake of his head. "No, but it's okay." He squeezed my hand weakly. "Thank you for everything." The next morning, I received a call from the day nurse telling me Richard had taken a turn for the worse. By the time I arrived, breathing hard from running from the parking lot, Amanda and her parents were already there. A doctor was checking Richard's vitals. "His organs are shutting down," the doctor said quietly. "It won't be long now." Amanda stood at the foot of the bed, her face composed, though her eyes were red. Her parents flanked her protectively. I moved to Richard's side and took his hand, which felt cool and light as paper. His breathing was shallow, irregular. For the next 4 hours, we waited. I spoke softly to Richard, reminding him of fishing trips and school science fairs, of proud moments and small everyday joys we'd shared. I don't know if he could hear me, but I needed to say these things, to remind both of us of the love that had always connected us. Richard took his last breath at 3:27 in the afternoon. I was still holding his hand. The sound that came from me was not human, a wail of grief so profound it seemed to come from somewhere beyond me. Amanda didn't cry. She stepped out to make arrangements before Richard's body was even cold. The next day, while I sat in my apartment surrounded by photos of Richard, unable to eat or sleep, Amanda was meeting with the board of Tech Fusion. I learned this not from her but from Garrett, Richard's old college friend who'd been with the company from the beginning. He called to offer condolences and mentioned the emergency board meeting. "Emergency board meeting?" I asked, confused. "Richard just died yesterday." There was an uncomfortable pause before Garrett said, "Amanda called it. She's been named interim CEO until the board can vote on permanent leadership." The funeral was 3 days later, a lavish affair at the most expensive funeral home in Boston. I had no say in any of the arrangements. When I asked Amanda if we could include a few personal touches, like playing the Beatles songs Richard had loved or displaying the fishing lures we'd collected over years of trips, she dismissed the ideas. "We need to be appropriate," she said. "This is as much a business event as a personal one. Richard's professional legacy needs to be honored." The service felt more like a corporate memorial than a goodbye to my son. Business associates gave speeches about Richard's acumen and vision. Amanda, dressed in an elegant black suit that looked fresh from a designer showroom, spoke eloquently about carrying forward his legacy. I was allotted 5 minutes to speak about my son's life. It wasn't enough. How could it be? The reception afterward was held at Richard and Amanda's home. I tried to spend time with Emma and Jackson, who at 5 years old didn't fully understand what was happening, but Amanda's parents kept them close, intercepting my attempts to comfort my own grandchildren. A week after the funeral, I went to the house with a box of Richard's childhood mementos, his Little League trophy, science fair ribbons, the model rocket we'd built together when he was 12. I thought Emma and Jackson might like to have these pieces of their father's history someday. Amanda met me in the foyer, glancing at the box with obvious disdain. "What's all this?" she asked. "Just some things from Richard's childhood," I explained. "Photos, awards, some of his favorite books. For the twins, when they're older." Amanda's expression hardened. "We're decluttering, actually. The house is being featured in Architectural Digest next month." I don't have room for old memorabilia. These aren't just things, I protested. They're pieces of Richard's life, his history. His history is tech fusion, she said coldly. That's the legacy that matters. Speaking of which, I've been meaning to talk to you about your expectations. My expectations? She crossed her arms. I've heard rumors you think you're entitled to some portion of Richard's company shares because of your early investment. Let me be perfectly clear. Don't expect a penny of your son's company shares. That investment was paid back years ago. Richard built Tech Fusion into what it is today through his own genius. I was stunned. I never said anything about shares. I just brought some keepsakes for my grandchildren. Let's not play games, Herman, she said, using my first name with obvious condescension. You contributed nothing to Richard's success, except a basement to work in, and some money he paid back with interest. Tech Fusion is my children's inheritance, not yours. And if you make trouble about this, you won't see Emma and Jackson at all. I stood there, box in my arms, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. This woman, who had known Richard for less than 10 years, was erasing my role in his life, threatening to cut me off from my grandchildren, dismissing decades of love and sacrifice as nothing. I just want to be a grandfather to them, I said quietly. That's all I'm asking. That's up to me now, isn't it? She replied with a thin smile. And I'll decide what's best for my children. I left with the box still in my arms, heartsick and stunned. Driving back to my apartment, I realized I'd lost not only my son but potentially my grandchildren too. The thought of never seeing Emma and Jackson grow up, never teaching them to fish as I'd taught Richard, never telling them stories about their father, was almost more than I could bear. That night, sitting alone among Richard's childhood treasures, I grieved not just for my son but for all that was being taken from me. The photos of Richard's gap-toothed first-grade smile, the handmade Father's Day cards, the high school graduation tassel, all tangible reminders of our life together that Amanda had dismissed as clutter. In that moment, I felt I had nothing left. 2 weeks after my confrontation with Amanda, I finally found the strength to go through the box of Richard's childhood mementos. Each item brought back a flood of memories, a small piece of the boy who had grown into a man I was fiercely proud of. At the bottom of the box, I found a folder of letters Richard had written during his first year of college. I'd forgotten about these, sent in the days before email was commonplace, when long-distance calls were expensive. I opened one at random, dated October 15th, his freshman year. Dear Dad, it began. Classes are tough, but I'm keeping up. My programming professor says I have real talent. I think about you working those extra shifts on the construction site, and it keeps me going when I want to give up. Someday I'll make enough money that you never have to climb another scaffold or pour another foundation in freezing weather. I promise. Love, Richard. I read letter after letter, each one filled with gratitude for my sacrifices and determination to make something of himself. In one, he wrote about a business class project where he had to interview an entrepreneur who inspired him. Other guys picked famous CEOs. Richard wrote, I told them about my dad, who raised me alone, worked 2 jobs, and still found time to help me build my first computer. That's the kind of dedication I want to bring to my own business someday. These words, written in my son's earnest handwriting from nearly 25 years ago, gave me strength. Richard had valued my contribution to his life, even if Amanda didn't. Digging deeper into the box, I found an old leather portfolio I didn't recognize. Inside was a printout of Richard's original business plan for Tech Fusion, complete with projections, market analysis, and staffing needs. On the investor page, my name was clearly listed, Herman Wallace, founding investor. There was also a notebook with Richard's handwriting detailing the terms of my $45,000 investment, structured not as a loan but as a 10% equity stake in the company. I had forgotten this detail, focusing only on being paid back the original amount with interest. But if these terms were still valid, I owned a portion of Tech Fusion. I called Thomas Blackwell, Richard's college roommate who had been present during those early days of the company. We met at a quiet coffee shop the next day. Thomas, now a successful software engineer himself, greeted me with a warm hug. "Herman, I'm so sorry about Richard," he said. "He was the best of us." Over coffee, I showed Thomas the notebook and original business plan. His eyes widened. "I remember this," he said. "Richard insisted on making you an equity investor, not just a lender. He said without you, there would be no company at all. He wanted you to benefit if Tech Fusion succeeded. Amanda claims I contributed nothing to Richard's success," I said. Thomas shook his head angrily. "That's ridiculous. Richard talked about you constantly, how you encouraged him, believed in him when no one else did. He turned down venture capital in the early days because they wanted too much control. He said he learned from you that independence was worth more than quick money." "Did Richard ever mention changing the structure of my investment?" I asked. "Not to me," Thomas said. "But in the last year or so, Richard seemed concerned about Amanda's influence on the company. He mentioned wanting to ensure certain people were protected." He hesitated. "Have you spoken with Diane, Richard's assistant?" Diane agreed to meet me the following day, but insisted on a park rather than a restaurant or coffee shop. She looked nervous when she arrived, glancing around as if worried about being seen. "I probably shouldn't be talking to you," she said after we exchanged greetings. "Amanda made everyone at the company sign new NDAs after Richard died. I just want to understand what happened to my investment," I explained. "Richard listed me as a founding investor with a 10% stake." Diane nodded. "I know. Richard talked about it several times in the months before he got sick. He was worried that the original paperwork hadn't been properly updated as the company grew." She lowered her voice. "Between us, I think he was concerned about Amanda's plans for the company. She was pushing for rapid expansion, more investment rounds that would dilute original shareholders. Did he do anything about it?" I asked. Diane glanced around again, then reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. "Richard had me prepare these documents before he got too sick to work. He made me promise to keep copies secure." She handed me the envelope. "I think you should have these. I've made copies for myself too, just in case." Inside were emails between Richard and the company's lawyers, discussing updating the corporate structure to protect founding stakeholders, with specific mention of me by name. There were draft documents formalizing my 10% stake and protecting it from dilution. Most significantly, there was a copy of an amendment to the operating agreement signed by Richard as CEO, just 2 weeks before his death, confirming my status and shareholding. "Did Amanda know about these?" I asked, stunned by what I was seeing. "I don't think so," Diane replied. "Richard had me work on this separately from her projects. He signed it when she was in New York for a conference." She hesitated, then added, "There's something else. Richard updated his will around the same time. I wasn't supposed to know, but I scheduled the meeting with his estate attorney. As I was processing this information, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number with a Boston area code. When I answered, a formal voice said, "Mr. Wallace, this is James Harrington from Harrington, Stevens & Boyd. I'm handling Richard Wallace's estate. We need you to attend the formal reading of the will this Friday at 10 a.m. Your presence is specifically requested." "By whom?" I asked, confused. "By the terms of the will itself, sir," the lawyer replied. "Attendance is mandatory for all named beneficiaries." I thanked him and ended the call, looking at Diane with surprise. That was Richard's lawyer. "There's a will reading on Friday." Diane smiled slightly. "Richard was always thorough. If he wanted to protect you, he would have done it properly." She stood to leave. "I should go. I can't be seen talking to you before the will is read. Amanda has people watching." As she walked away, I called after her, "Thank you, Diane." She turned briefly. "Don't thank me." Richard valued loyalty. He was good to those who were good to him. With that, she disappeared down the path, leaving me holding an envelope that might change everything. I arrived at the offices of Harrington, Stevens & Boyd 15 minutes early on Friday morning. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown Boston skyscraper, the kind of place that screamed old money and power. The reception area featured leather furniture, oriental rugs, and oil paintings of stern-looking founding partners. A young associate led me to a conference room where several people were already gathered. Amanda sat at the far end of a massive mahogany table, flanked by two sharp-looking attorneys and her parents. She wore a tailored black dress that managed to suggest both mourning and boardroom readiness. When she saw me, her expression flickered with annoyance before settling into careful neutrality. Several Tech Fusion executives I recognized from the funeral sat clustered together, along with Garrett and Thomas. Diane was there too, sitting quietly in a corner, a portfolio open on her lap. No one sat near me when I took a seat at the opposite end of the table from Amanda. At precisely 10 o'clock, James Harrington entered. He was in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with his firm's logo. Two younger attorneys accompanied him, one carrying a video setup. "Good morning," Harrington said, his voice resonant with authority. "We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Allen Wallace. Before we begin, I must confirm that all required parties are present." He called roll from a list. When everyone was accounted for, he nodded to one of his associates, who distributed sealed envelopes to each person present. "Mr. Wallace left specific instructions for this meeting," Harrington explained. "Each of you has received a personal letter from him, to be opened after the reading of the will. I ask that you refrain from opening these until we have concluded the formal proceedings." I held my envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hands. A final message from my son. I had to fight back tears just thinking about it. Harrington opened his portfolio and began reading in a clear, measured voice. The first portions of the will were standard, establishing that Richard was of sound mind when the document was prepared 3 months earlier. Then came specific bequests. "To my wife, Amanda Cassidy Wallace, I leave our primary residence and all contents therein, with exceptions to be noted, along with our vacation properties in Aspen and Martha's Vineyard, all personal vehicles, and joint financial accounts." Amanda nodded slightly, as if this was exactly what she expected. Her attorney made notes on a legal pad. "To my children, Emma Marie Wallace and Jackson Richard Wallace, I establish a trust for their education and well-being, details of which are contained in Schedule A, attached to this will." Harrington continued through several smaller bequests, including charitable donations and gifts to longtime employees. Garrett received Richard's vintage car collection. Thomas was given their shared patent on an early security algorithm. Diane received a generous cash gift and Richard's personal library of technical books. Throughout these readings, Amanda maintained her composed expression, though I noticed her checking her watch several times. She clearly believed the major items, particularly Richard's controlling interest in Tech Fusion, would naturally come to her. I found myself holding my breath, waiting. Finally, Harrington turned to a section titled Company Ownership and Governance. "Regarding my majority ownership of Tech Fusion Incorporated," he read, "I hereby direct the following distribution of my shares." The room grew completely still. Even Amanda's attorneys leaned forward. "To my father, Herman James Wallace, I confirm and formalize his status as founding investor of Tech Fusion, with an ownership stake of 10% of all shares, protected from future dilution through the mechanism detailed in the corporate amendment dated April 2nd of this year." Amanda's face drained of color. Her attorney whispered urgently in her ear. Harrington continued, "In addition to this existing stake, I bequeath to my father an additional 20% of my personal shares in recognition of his essential role in the creation and success of Tech Fusion." There were audible gasps around the table. Amanda's face had gone from pale to flushed with anger. She started to speak, but Harrington held up a hand to silence her. "This combined 30% ownership stake shall carry with it a permanent seat on the board of directors, with all voting rights and privileges thereto." Amanda could contain herself no longer. "This is preposterous," she exclaimed. "Herman has no business experience. He knows nothing about running a tech company." "Mrs. Wallace," Harrington said firmly, "please allow me to complete the reading before raising objections." Chastened but still fuming, Amanda fell silent. "Furthermore," Harrington continued, I establish that 20% of my shares shall be held in trust for my children, Emma and Jackson, until they reach the age of 25. This trust shall be jointly administered by my wife, Amanda Wallace, and my father, Herman Wallace, with neither having unilateral authority to make decisions regarding these shares. Amanda's attorney was furiously writing notes now. Her parents looked stunned. The remaining 50% of my shares I bequeath to my wife, Amanda, with the provision that major decisions regarding company direction, acquisition, or sale must be approved by a supermajority of the board, including the vote of the founding investor representative. In other words, nothing significant could happen at Tech Fusion without my approval. Richard had ensured I would have a voice in the company's future. Harrington then picked up an envelope from his portfolio. Richard requested that this letter be read aloud at this time. He opened it and began to read. To those I love and am leaving behind. If this letter is being read, it means my time came sooner than any of us hoped. I want to explain my decisions regarding Tech Fusion, the company that has been my life's work. My father, Herman Wallace, wasn't just my first investor. He was my first believer. When banks wouldn't loan me money and venture capitalists wanted controlling interest, Dad gave me everything he had saved. He didn't do it as a business decision. He did it because he believed in me. For 30 years, my father sacrificed his own dreams to support mine. He worked construction in freezing winters to pay for my education. He sold our family home so I could attend Boston University. He gave up his retirement savings to fund Tech Fusion. Without him, there would be no company, no success, no legacy to leave behind. I've watched with sadness as he has been increasingly sidelined in our family life. That ends now. My father deserves recognition for his role in creating everything we have, and he deserves a relationship with his grandchildren. My hope is that this will ensure both. Tears were streaming down my face now. Richard's words, his recognition of our bond, meant more to me than any amount of money or shares. Amanda stood suddenly. I contest this will. Richard was on heavy pain medication when this was prepared. He wasn't of sound mind. My attorneys will file objections immediately. Harrington seemed unfazed. Mrs. Wallace, you may certainly pursue that course if you wish. However, you should be aware that Richard anticipated such a challenge. He had himself evaluated by 2 independent psychiatrists on the day he signed these documents. He also recorded a video statement. He nodded to his associate, who set up a laptop and projector. A moment later, Richard's face appeared on a screen at the end of the room. Though clearly ill, his eyes were alert and focused. My name is Richard Allen Wallace, he said in the recording. Today is April 15th. I am of sound mind, as has been verified by Dr. Leonard Stevens and Dr. Maria Rodriguez, whose assessments are included with my will. I am making this recording to confirm that the provisions in my will and the recent amendments to the Tech Fusion operating agreement reflect my clear and uncoerced wishes, Richard continued, explaining his decisions in detail, occasionally pausing to sip water. His reasoning was lucid, his intentions unmistakable. When the video ended, Amanda stood again, grabbing her purse and gesturing to her attorneys to follow. This isn't over, she snapped, glaring at me before storming out of the room, her parents hurrying after her. The remaining attendees sat in stunned silence for a moment before Harrington cleared his throat. You may now open your personal letters from Richard, he said. With shaking hands, I broke the seal on my envelope. Inside was a single page with Richard's familiar handwriting. Dad, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry for the years we lost, for allowing distance to grow between us. The truth is, I was caught between my love for you and my life with Amanda. I made the wrong choice too many times. This is my attempt to make things right. You gave me everything, and I gave too little in return. The shares are just money and power. What matters is that Emma and Jackson know their grandfather, that they learn from you as I did. Tell them about me, about our fishing trips and science projects. Tell them I loved them, and know that I loved you, always. Your son, Richard. I sat there long after the others had left, holding that letter, feeling a complicated mix of grief and vindication. Richard had seen the truth after all. He had found a way to reach out from beyond death to restore my place in our family. Now, it would be up to me to use this gift wisely. Amanda's legal challenges began immediately. Her attorneys filed motions claiming undue influence and diminished capacity. They demanded psychiatric evaluations be thrown out and argued that Richard had been manipulated in his weakened state. For 3 months, I endured depositions and hearings, all while grieving my son. But Richard had indeed been thorough. The psychiatrists testified to his mental clarity despite his illness. Former employees and friends gave statements about Richard's consistent expressions of gratitude toward me throughout the years. Most damaging to Amanda's case, Diane provided emails showing Richard had been planning these changes for over a year, long before his illness became severe. 6 months after the will reading, the court upheld Richard's wishes in their entirety. I officially took my seat on the Tech Fusion Board of Directors at the next quarterly meeting. Walking into the gleaming boardroom, I felt out of place in my only suit, surrounded by tech executives in designer clothes. But I reminded myself that I belonged there, not because of business acumen, but because Richard wanted me there. My first board meeting was tense. Amanda, still serving as CEO, presented expansive growth plans that would have involved taking on significant debt and moving away from the core security products that had made the company successful. When it came time to vote, I asked simple, direct questions about how these changes would affect the small business customers that had been Richard's original focus. "With all due respect, Mr. Wallace," Amanda said with barely concealed contempt, "the enterprise market is where the real growth potential lies. Richard's original vision, while charming, is no longer relevant in today's market." I looked around the table at the other board members, most of whom seemed intimidated by Amanda's forceful personality. "My son," I said quietly but firmly, "built this company to protect small businesses that couldn't afford enterprise-level security. That was his mission. I believe we honor him by continuing it, not by abandoning it for faster profits." To my surprise, several board members nodded in agreement. The expansion plan was voted down. It was the first of many battles, but an important one. I wasn't there to take control or impose my will, but to ensure Richard's true vision wasn't lost. Outside the boardroom, my fight to be part of my grandchildren's lives was even more challenging. Despite the provisions in the will making me co-trustee of their trust, Amanda continued to limit my access. Scheduled visits were canceled at the last minute. Phone calls went unanswered. I could have returned to court, but I chose patience instead. I sent cards and appropriate gifts for birthdays and holidays. I showed up at their school events, staying at a respectful distance but making sure they saw me there, supporting them. I kept a detailed journal of every attempt at contact, every cancellation, every small interaction. 3 months after the court's final ruling, I received an unexpected call from Emma and Jackson's school. They were having Grandparents' Day, and the twins had put my name on the list of invitees. Amanda hadn't bothered to tell me. I arrived bearing no gifts, just my presence and love. The classroom was filled with grandparents, watching their grandchildren present art projects and sing songs. I sat in the back, not wanting to cause a scene if Amanda objected to my presence. But when Emma spotted me, she broke from the group and ran over. "Grandpa, you came!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around my waist. Jackson followed a moment later, more reserved but clearly pleased. "We made family trees," Emma said, pulling me toward their desk. "I put you on ours. Teacher said we could put anyone who's family to us." There on a large poster board was a crayon drawing of a tree. At the top were Richard and Amanda, with Emma and Jackson below them. On one side were Amanda's parents, and on the other, alone on my branch, was a stick figure labeled Grandpa Herman. "Dad used to talk about you," Jackson said quietly, "before he got sick. He said you taught him to fish and fix things. He said you were the best dad," Emma added. I fought back tears. "Your dad was pretty special himself," I managed to say. "Would you like to hear some stories about him when he was your age?" They nodded eagerly, and for the next 20 minutes, I shared age-appropriate tales of Richard's childhood adventures, his first computer, the rocket we built together, They listened with rapt attention, hungry for connections to the father they'd lost so young. When Amanda arrived to pick them up, her face tightened seeing me there, but with teachers and other grandparents watching, she maintained a civil facade. "The children need to leave now," she said stiffly. "Can Grandpa Herman come over sometime?" Emma asked innocently. "He tells good stories about Daddy." Amanda hesitated, clearly caught between her personal feelings and the public setting. "We'll see," she said finally. "We're very busy these days." "Please, Mom," Jackson pressed, unusually assertive for his normally quiet nature. "Dad would want us to know about when he was little." Something in those words seemed to reach Amanda. For a brief moment, I saw uncertainty in her eyes, perhaps even a flicker of shame. "We'll schedule something," she conceded. "Have your assistant contact mine, Herman." It wasn't warm, but it was a start. Over the next year, small breakthroughs accumulated. Monthly visits became weekly ones. I was included in Emma's ballet recital and Jackson's science fair. For their 6th birthday, Amanda reluctantly allowed me to host a fishing trip to the same lake where Richard and I had spent so many peaceful Sundays. At Tech Fusion, I worked to protect Richard's legacy while respecting the need for sound business decisions. I didn't interfere with day-to-day operations but used my board position to ensure the company maintained its commitment to serving small businesses alongside its growing enterprise division. I established a scholarship fund in Richard's name for underprivileged students interested in cybersecurity. Amanda remained cool and businesslike, but the open hostility gradually faded. I think she realized that fighting me was draining energy she needed for running the company and raising the children. Or perhaps she simply recognized that I wasn't trying to take anything away from her, only to preserve my place in my grandchildren's lives. 2 years after Richard's death, I took Emma and Jackson to his favorite fishing spot on Lake Champlain. We sat in the same small boat where Richard and I had spent countless hours talking or simply enjoying comfortable silence. "Did Dad catch a lot of fish here?" Jackson asked, carefully baiting his hook the way I'd taught him. "Some days," I replied with a smile. "But that wasn't really the point of fishing for your dad and me. It was about being together, having time to talk or just be quiet together." "I miss him," Emma said suddenly. "Sometimes I can't remember what his voice sounded like." I pulled out my phone and opened a video Richard had sent me years earlier, one I'd watched countless times since his death. In it, he was standing by this very lake, holding up a modest-sized base. "Dad, I finally caught one bigger than yours," he exclaimed in the video, his face alight with boyish excitement despite being in his 30s at the time. Emma and Jackson watched transfixed, their eyes wide at seeing their father so alive, so happy. "He was fun," Jackson said softly when the video ended. "Yes, he was," I agreed. "And brave and smart and kind. You both have pieces of him in you. Emma, you have his creativity. Jackson, you have his patience and attention to detail." We spent the rest of that day telling stories, catching a few fish, and creating new memories while honoring old ones. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting everything in a golden glow, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since before Richard's illness. Amanda had been right about one thing. Richard's true legacy wasn't just his company. It was these 2 children, and the values and memories they would carry forward. I was grateful beyond words that I could be part of shaping that legacy, of ensuring they knew not just the successful businessman their father became, but the curious, kind-hearted boy he had been. Life still had its challenges. Amanda and I would never be close, though we had reached a workable understanding. Tech Fusion continued to face the pressures of a competitive industry. The grief of losing Richard would never completely disappear. But sitting in that boat with my grandchildren, watching them reel in their lines as the day ended, I knew that the most important battle had been won. Not the fight for shares or board seats or legal recognition, but the fight to preserve the bonds of family across generations. "So what do you think?" I asked them as we packed up our gear. "Should we make this a regular thing, coming out here to fish like your dad and I used to?" "Yes," they replied in unison. "Good," I said, smiling. "Your dad would like that." As I steered the boat back toward shore, I felt Richard's presence as strongly as if he were sitting beside me. I could almost hear him say, "Thanks, Dad, for everything. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought as hard to stay in your grandchildren's lives? Have you ever had to stand up for your place in a family?" Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you found meaning in my story, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear it. Remember, sometimes the most important inheritance isn't measured in dollars or company shares, but in the love and memories we pass from one generation to the next.